All right, guys, in this episode, we're going to talk about the NAR settlement. It came out about 3 months ago. I've been hesitant to make a video on it because there's a lot of things that had to shake out, and they've pretty much shaken out. It's going to go into effect on August 17th. But I'm going to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly regarding this settlement, specifically not only just for buyers, but for sellers. Sellers are going to be impacted by this more than they may realize. So if you're involved in real estate at all, or you're looking to buy or sell, or you've heard about this settlement and you've seen different videos on YouTube about this, I'm going to come in with a little bit of a different perspective of why this happened, and talk to you about the good, the bad, and the ugly of what's going to happen on August 17th, and to beware of what to look out for. So without further ado, we're going to get after that right now. All right, guys, welcome back to the channel here at Live Life in Maine. My name is Scott Thibeau. I'm a broker with EXP Realty, probably the fastest growing real estate company in the world now. I'm an investor. I own multiple properties. I've developed a little bit. I own a couple businesses. But more importantly than all that, guys, I'm a veteran. I served this country honorably from 86 to 94. I'm a dad of 5 children, a granddad of 2, soon to be 3 grandchildren, and a husband, of course, my beautiful wife, Nicole. And I've lived in Maine almost my whole life, other than the military. My wife has been up here for about 20 something years, where I met her. So in this episode, guys, as I said, we're going to talk about the NAR settlement agreement, the National Association of Realtors, and what that means for both buyers and sellers, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I'm sure you've heard about this, but I'm just going to go over it real quick. Back in, I want to say March or April, not quite sure the time frame, a bunch of attorneys in the middle of the country get together and they filed a class action lawsuit stating that there was corruption or there was steering, and that sellers were paying buyer commissions and they didn't know about it, and therefore they shouldn't have had to. And it changed the whole way we're going to do business in this industry in about 20 days. Today is July 30th, actually. And it's going to happen on August 17th. But let's just talk about even how it came to be. So for the longest time, there has been a cooperative effort between buyer agents and seller agents to share commissions from what the listing agent is going to ask for a commission from the from the seller. So in other words, I'm going to just give you an example. I go into a house, I give a listing presentation, I get hired, and the seller agrees that my listing commission is 5%. Now, the seller, most times, 95% of the time, does not care how I spend that 5%. Just knowing that I'm not going to get any more. I can spend it on marketing. I can spend it on helping the seller sell their house. I can spend it on whatever I want. And I can also give some of it to a fellow broker of mine, or a peer of mine, or another realtor in the industry that may bring a buyer to the equation and wants to get paid from my listing commission. So the seller really didn't pay the buyer. Some sellers who get in the weeds want to know how much is going for the buy side and how much is going to the sell side. But mostly sellers don't really care, at least in my experience. They just know, here's the commission, and however you spend it, just sell my house, get the best value for my house, the best price for my house, with the best terms. Obviously, cash offer, no contingencies, highest price would be great. They don't care how the listing broker, in the most part, distributes that money. Now, here's another fun fact, guys. I just did this study. In 2023, Out of all the homes that were sold by realtors, all the listings that were sold by realtors, which is about 90%. So of all the homes that were sold by realtors, all the homes that were sold, period, in 2023 in the United States were sold, 90% of them were sold by realtors. Of that 90% of homes that were sold by realtors, 93% of them were sold with a buyer agent involved. In other words, only 7% of houses sold by realtors in 2023 did the listing broker sell and have a buyer for that house. In other words, represented both sides of the equation. Didn't have a buyer broker involved. The other 93% of homes sold in the United States in 2023 by a listing agent or a listing broker had a buyer broker involved in the transaction. There were two parties to be. The other 10% of houses that were sold in this country that were not listed or sold by realtors were mostly for sale by owners or sales from one family member to another. But most of them were for sale by owners, and we all get why for sale by owners try to sell their own house. They do it because they don't want to pay a listing commission, which is normally the case. However, of that 10% of the houses that were sold in this country last year by Thibeau's, do you know that 7% of those, not 7%, 97%, in other words, 7 out of 10, actually 70%, 7 out of 10, had a buyer broker on the other side. So while the for sale by owner did not have a listing agent representing them trying to sell their house, a broker came with a buyer, and the for sale by owner paid some sort of dues to the buyer broker for bringing that client. Generally, the estimate's been about 2%, 2.5% of what the total price was. So while the for sale by owner did not pay a listing commission of, let's say, 5%, they did pay a buyer commission of around 2 to 2.5%. So with all that being said, back to this settlement, back to this lawsuit back in April or May, whenever it happened, a bunch of sellers got together with lawyers and said, hey, you signed a contract to say you'll sell your house. Maybe it was 6%, maybe it was 5% commission to the listing agent. And the listing agent gave some of that commission to the buyer agent to help sell your house out. But you're not happy with that. You shouldn't have had to pay that buyer agent those commissions. You should have just paid your listing agent. Right? You don't have to pay for a buyer agent fee. Why? Why would you do that? And the reality is, guys, they technically weren't. They were paying a commission to the listing agent. The listing agent, the listing realtor, the listing broker, whatever you want to call us, gave a portion of that commission and documented it in the MLS to a buyer broker. If a buyer agent, realtor, broker brought a buyer to the table, negotiated a contract, and got paid once the deal closed. So President Biden has the audacity to stand up and say this should bring housing prices down, now that the sellers do not have to pay a buyer broker. So here's the good part of this settlement. First of all, I've been in this industry for 11 years, since 2013, and I can tell you the barrier to getting into the industry is pretty low. Unfortunately, it should be a lot higher. Actually, I was listening to the John Tesh radio show. This was a little while ago, maybe over a year ago, and there was a survey. And the survey was, talk about the least respected professions in the United States. And to my chagrin, I was surprised that a real estate broker, according to the survey, or a real estate agent, a realtor, was listed lower than a used car salesman. In other words, people trusted a used car salesman more than they trusted a realtor. So what does that say about the industry? That's not a good thing. It really isn't, especially when you are most likely transacting on one of the largest financial transactions you'll ever do, or multiple transactions if you buy multiple homes or sell multiple homes. So that's not good. Here's a couple reasons why I think that happened and why it has happened. In Maine anyways, you pay some money You spend 54 hours studying to be a realtor, studying law, studying the real estate laws, studying what requires you to be a realtor in Maine, the ethics, the rules, the fiduciary responsibilities. Then you go to the state and you take a test by professional regulations, and you sit in this room and you can't bring anything in with you other than maybe a calculator and a pencil, and you take this test. And if you're lucky to pass this test, and I don't know the percentages of people that pass this test on the first time, I think it's pretty high. I do know some people that did not pass the test on the first time, but I passed the test on the first time, and I know a lot of my peers did well. You just got to do your homework, whether you take a class online, whether you take it in person. You just got to understand and do your due diligence and actually spend those 54 hours understanding the real estate to pass this test. So you pass the test, then you take your license. So now you have a license to sell real estate, but you have to hang it with a real estate company. And in my case, I hung mine with EXP. Actually, I hung it with somebody else first, but I came to EXP after down the road. I hung mine with EXP Realty, and I'm a broker with EXP Realty. And essentially, you're off and running. You are now licensed to sell real estate. Now, what has happened in the industry is there's a lot of people, and I'm not going to get into age or race or anything like that, but there has been a lot of people that think there's quick money to be made in real estate. And therefore, they spent a measly, it's about $1,000 when you're all said and done, between paying for the course, taking the exam, paying the National Association of Realtors to become a broker or a realtor, and hanging your license with an agency. It's generally, let's call it $1,000, maybe a little bit more, but it's $1,000. The barrier of entry financially is pretty low. But now you're licensed to sell real estate with no real world experience in selling real estate other than some stuff you've learned on a piece of paper. So here comes Mrs. Brady, and she wants to sell her house, and her daughter has just become a real estate agent. Well, her daughter is going to list because she's going to give the listing to her daughter, and her daughter may or may not know whatever she's doing. Now, she's supposed to have a mentor, her daughter, and understand what's going on, but I haven't seen that happen very often. Worst case is, this is the worst case of that whole scenario. Mrs. Brady doesn't own a house and she wants to buy a house, and her daughter just became a realtor. So she contracts with her daughter to help her buy a house. Well, the daughter has no idea how to buy a house, just read how to do pass a test. And she now has access to multiple listing service, and she sees this cute little house down the street from where they grew up that's for sale, and she sees that the listing agent, the realtor, is offering a 2% commission if they bring a buyer to the house and it gets negotiated and it goes to close. So little Janice tells Mrs. Brady, her mother, hey, there's this house down the street. I'm going to open the door for you. I'm going to let you look at it. If you want to make an offer, I think you should. Here's what they're asking. Let's make an offer. She makes an offer. How do you make an offer? That's a whole different ballgame. It can be pretty simple, but you got to really understand things about it. So people sometimes make it too simple. People don't cross their I's and dot their T's. The offer gets accepted. Janice, Mrs. Brady's daughter, gets paid at closing because Mrs. Brady just bought the house and paid the real estate commission. Really, the seller did, but where did the seller get the real estate commission from? The buyer, to pay Janice that real estate fee. Now, what did Janice do for that? She opened the door. She told Mrs. Brady about the house. She opened the door. She worked with Mrs. Brady to create a purchase and sale agreement that the listing agent, the seller accepted, and it went to close, and she got paid 2% of whatever that house was. Just, let's say the house is $300,000. So she got paid $6,000. This is the challenge in the industry, most likely. And this is what I feel. For too long, buyer brokers have not been transparent, or had not had to been transparent with their clients. Buyer brokers would often say, I'm working for free. You're not paying me. The seller's paying me. So if I find you a house, you don't have to worry about paying me. The seller's going to pay me, and I will take whatever the listing agent is offering as a commission. Typically, that's been between 2 and 3% on average. Okay, guys? So There's been really no transparency. Sounds initially, it sounds good initially from the buyer. Hey, I get this service for free. But the old adage, what you get for free, what you pay for, you get, right? So I'm not saying all buyer brokers are like this, by the way, either. So I just want to digress. There are some really good buyer brokers out there, and I'm one of them. I help people buy homes. I also help people sell homes. But there was no transparency in what the buyer broker, what the buyer agent, what the buyer realtor was going to offer, was going to do for the buyer, right? There was no, this is what you get when you hire me. There was none of that. It was just, let's find a house. We'll close on. We'll get the house on the contract. We'll close. Never mind negotiations. Never mind the different types of loans that are available. Never mind if there's something wrong with the house and the inspections and what they have to do with that. Never mind the appraisal. Never mind understanding how a house works or the different problems if there's leach fields or wells or any of that. Just if the house gets to closing, I'm going to get paid 2%. And you don't have to worry about it because you don't pay me. The seller pays me. And that has been the way things have worked for quite a while, at least since I've been in the industry, since 2011. So a bunch of people get in the industry first, and they have buyers. They have friends that want to buy houses, and they try to represent them, and they get them a house, and great. Sounds great. But now with the NAR settlement, buyer brokers now have to not only get a contract from the buyer first saying, this is what you're going to pay me. This is the contract that's agreed to be paid for my services. Most buyers, if they're smart, are going to say, what am I paying for? In other words, what do I get when I hire you? Because the seller has the right not to pay a buyer fee, a buyer commission. And if I have to pay it all to you, in other words, the seller's not going to pay it out of the closing, out of the disbursement of the funds, what am I going to get paid? What am I going to get for if I go to contract and I close? What are you going to give me? That's the good. That's the transparency of this NAR settlement. And that's what I think is really, really good. I think there needs to be more transparency. I can't tell you how many years I've been involved with buyers and they had a representative, but there was no contract in place. And me as a listing agent did all the work or most of the work or coaxed along the buyer broker because they were new and they didn't really have any help or maybe little on how to get this done. Meanwhile, I have to maintain my fiduciary responsibilities to my client, the seller, so I can't tell too much. All I can say is you need this form, this form, this form, whatever, and you work it out, right? So it was really doing the buyer a disjustice because the buyer broker really wasn't sure what they were doing. But that has happened in the industry. Seller doesn't care. All the seller cares about at the end of the day is that they get paid for the house, the most they could get paid for minus whatever they owed, and everything went smooth and they closed it fast. So that's really what the seller cares for. When a seller hires a listing agent in general, the seller's hoping that the listing agent will get the highest and best price for that house. It'll go smooth and they'll close quickly or they'll close within the seller's time frame. That's what the seller really cares for. And most listing brokers, if they're good, and to be a listing broker, you got to be a little bit more on your game than if you're a buyer broker. You got to articulate why you should be hired, what you're going to do for them, and what it's going to take to sell their house at the most and highest best price. Now, that's the good part of it. Here's the bad part. Here's the bad part of it, guys. It says that because of this NAR settlement and buyers are now going to have to potentially pay the buyer agent the fee that they agreed to in the beginning if the seller or the listing agent does not convince the seller to give some concessions, which are not listed on them, which will no longer be listed on a multiple listing service. The buyer will have to pay the buyer agent directly at closing or at a closing cost, right? So there are going to be some buyers that can't afford that, right? Especially if buyer brokers are used to getting paid 2 or 3% of what the price of the house was. And in this example, Mrs. Brady bought a house for $300,000. And if the commission was 2%, then Mrs. Brady, on top of closing costs for the loan, buying the house on it, is going to have to pay additional $6,000 to her daughter Janice for helping her buy that house. Now, I can tell you guys, the bad part of this is it's kind of much to do about nothing, but there are going to be a lot of buyers that feel like I'm not going to get represented. I can't pay a buyer broker to do this. And therefore, I'm going to go directly to the listing agent. which is going to be the ugly, because a listing agent's fiduciary responsibilities are to the seller, not to the buyer. So the listing agent, if they're ethical and honest, you hear this due disclosure or due agency representing both sides. We all know, guys, you cannot represent both sides equally. You just can't. It is natural conflict of interest. The buyer is trying to get the house for the least amount of money possible, and the seller is trying to sell the house for the most amount of money that's possible. So normally, in normal terms, there's a conflict of interest. Which side do you represent? Because you can't represent them equally. You can shuffle some paperwork for the buyer side, but at the end of the day, because you have the listing is more important to you than this one buyer, specifically because there may be other buyers that come along the table. So I think what's going to happen is you're going to see some buyers who are a little confused are going to go directly to a listing agent and make an offer directly to the listing agent, understanding that they're not going to get the representation that they would have had they had a good buyer broker. Normally, notice I said good, not one that just got their license, or not one that some people have just got their license and really good because they were practicing real estate for a long time in a different way, like mortgage brokers or insurance people, whatever. But because they're not going to have somebody looking out for their best interest, they could get bamboozled a little bit, and they won't know until after they close the house. So specifically, if there's issues with the house that was not caught during the inspection phase or during the due diligence phase. That is why, in my opinion, 93% of all the houses that were sold by realtors last year had a buyer broker involved on one side of the equation because they needed representation. So that's the bad part, right? The bad part is listing agents will now may do both sides of the equation. The buyer is going to be out in the cold somewhat because they're not going to know what to do. The worst case scenario of this is they're not even going to go to a listing agent. They're going to go online, download some forms, make an offer to the seller, and maybe that offer gets accepted, but then it goes to a closing title attorney. And let me tell you a conversation I had with a title attorney, one of my friends. His office does about 2,000 transactions, closings a year. It's a pretty big office, and here in Maine, and they've already revamped their pricing structure for represented versus non-represented clients. He said prior to this NAR settlement, he didn't have an exact percentage, but he believes it's in the high 90s, that most of the clients that come through the door have representation on both sides. And because they have representation on both sides and they get to them, obviously the T's and C's have all been worked out, the negotiations have all been worked out. Their biggest job is make sure that everybody's legal, make sure that the deed is not encumbered, make sure the title is good, and to shuffle the paperwork and do the work. And they don't have to do, I won't say they don't have to do much, because in Maine, it's an attorney state. You have to have an attorney agree to the deal and sign off on the deal. They do their thing, and it's very important what they do. But all the stuff that the brokers have done behind the scenes, they don't have to do. They're afraid. My friend, as an example, said he may be involved in their office, may be involved in some of this. So therefore, there are going to be different fees. I said, well, what do you think those fees are going to be? And he said, I have no idea, Scott. I have no idea what we could be walking into. He did say they probably aren't going to be as high as what a buyer broker would make, like in this example, 2% of, like, say, if it was a $300,000 house. But he did say it could be. Depends on, he's seen transactions, that high 90% that had represents. There were some that didn't. He gave an example of one. They walked in. There was a white piece of paper. I, so-and-so, do hereby agree to buy this house located at this address for this amount, signed by the buyer, signed by the seller. And it's a note. The buyer may not have any idea what they're buying. The address doesn't tell the whole story. You got to look at the deed. You got to look at the boundaries. You got to look at some of the encumbrances, the right-of-ways, all that stuff. But they do all this due diligence. And he said, often when that happens, the transaction does not go smoothly. It's challenging because once they realize a few things, like as an example, he gave me one where the house, they added a deck and the deck sat too close to the boundary line, the boundary setback of 50 feet. It was within that 50-foot and there was no permit pulled. So when they did their mortgage inspection, they realized that the deck was over the boundary line. And they had to go back in front of code to get approval. And code said, no, you can't get approval. You're going to have to go in front of the planning board to get a one-off, or we'll give you a variance, but you got to go prove to why your deck was closer than it should have been because the permit was never pulled, number one, which is a big no. And number two, code in this example said, no, you have to tear down that part of the deck. So the buyer thought that they're buying this beautiful deck, but this beautiful deck was encumbered on the setbacks, and this the town did not allow it to go through because there was no permit pulled. If there would have been a permit pulled, they might have looked the other way or would have maybe set a variance, but there was never a permit pulled by the seller originally, and therefore, because the buyer didn't do the due diligence and the seller didn't disclose this, they become a bone of contention, and now the buyer's trying to sue the seller, and that's just one example, guys. I'm not saying it's all like that, but normally when there's representation from the buyer and representation for the seller, things go a lot smoother when you have when you have realtors that know what they're doing. And in the spirit of cooperation, that has been going on since I've been a realtor, since 2013, excuse me. So now that's all changed. But has it? Because when I have a listing, and I'm going on a listing appointment this afternoon, I'm going to be very clear with the seller. Listen, my job is to try to sell your house for the highest, best price, with the best contract, with the best terms. Now, there are a lot of realtors out there that have clients. And I will try to bring one of my buyers that I have to your listing to see if they're interested. But I do not have as many buyers as the rest of the state's agents do, right? It's not even close. So what happens if one of my peers in the industry has a buyer and wants to buy the house, but wants some concessions? And my answer is going to be for my seller, this is what I recommend. Fiduciarily, this is what I recommend. You don't have to pay anything. My fee is going to be 3%. You don't have to pay anything, but I would recommend that you give some closing cost concessions of a percentage. And my ask is going to be that she's prepared to pay between 2% and 2.5%. Because if the buyer comes from a different agency or a different broker, not my own buyers, that buyer is going to want to get paid, and he or she's going to try to make sure that the buyer does not have to pay them or does not have to pay them the full boat. So they're going to ask for some concessions. That will be allowed to ask for some concessions. The bigger part of it is now my client, which was a seller, is now a buyer. And she's going to be in the same boat when she goes to buy that the buyer that just was going to buy her house was in when she sold it to him. So this is why I say it's much ado about nothing, because most homes, most sellers understand there's a fee to be paid, and while they don't have to pay the buyer broker fee, and they never had to, there's never been anything that said they had to. The DOJ and attorneys are the ones that got. Specifically, the attorneys are the ones that made the most money. Now, here's the other crazy thing that President Biden said. The prices of houses should come down. Do you really think that's going to happen? So let me ask you a question. If you're a seller out there and you're thinking about selling your house and you're looking around and you bring in some agents and they tell you your house is worth X. And I'm just going to give an example. I'm going to go back to that $300,000. Your house is worth $300,000. Okay? Because everything we looked around says it's worth $300,000. The appraiser's going to get comps, competitive market analysis. They're going to get comps from other homes to see what they've sold for. And I believe your house is worth $300,000. Let's just say, for the most part, the realtor is correct. Your house is worth $300,000. Are you, as a seller, going to say, well, since I don't have to pay 2 or 3% to the buyer, I'm going to reduce my $300,000 house down to, let's just say it's 2%, down to $294,000 because I don't have to pay a buyer commission, right? I'll sell my house for $294,000 because I don't have to pay a buyer commission. Are you going to do that as a seller? I think your answer is no. And here's why. Because all those houses that sold for $300,000 that are around you all paid a buyer commission, or 90% of them paid a buyer commission because they had buyer representation. So it was baked into the number. So you're going to keep your house at the same price, and you're going to understand that all those people paid a buyer commission. I'm going to probably have to offer some type of concession to the buyer, whether it's a commission or some type of closing cost. I'm going to offer some type of concession to the buyer if they bring me an offer and want to buy my house. And that concession, let's just use an example, is 2%. And the buyer broker and the buyer's got to work out how that 2% gets paid, right? But I'm going to offer that concession because if I didn't offer that concession, I'm going to have a lot less buyers looking at my house because my realtor doesn't have all the buyers that all these other agents have, all these other realtors have, right? So it's not going to reduce prices, guys. It really isn't. It's just going to, it's a shell game. They're going to go from this is the commission being offered by a seller to this is the concession being offered by a seller to the buyer in closing costs, and the buyer and the buyer broker will work out behind the scenes, has nothing to do with the seller, how that is paid. But again, the good thing is the buyers have to be now have transparency with their agents, with their representation, what they're going to get. And if the seller is offering more of a concession than the buyer broker is charging the fee, let's just say the seller is offering a 3% concession to the buyer, and the buyer broker is only asking for 2%, well, that's a good thing for the buyer because the buyer is only going to pay the buyer broker that 2%, which is going to come from the 3% concession the seller's going to, and they're going to keep a percent to go to their closing costs. So that's a good thing. So buyer brokers are not going to be able to sell their houses for more or make more commission just because the listing agent or the buyer or the seller chose to offer more. That's the good thing. And the other good thing is buyers are no longer going to be able to open up a door to show a house unless they have a contract. So too many times, especially Zillow's synonymous with this, right? You pay a ton of money to become a Zillow preferred agent. And you got some buyer out there that contacts Zillow, and Zillow calls the preferred agent, and the preferred agent runs right down, opens the door, shows them the house. Then if the buyer likes the house, they go to a contract. Hopefully the buyer broker will say, I can't represent you, write a contract until I at least have a contract between you and I. And they do that. You can't do that anymore. In order to show houses for buyers, buyer brokers, in order to show houses in person or online or through, tours or anything like that. Like as a buyer broker, you can't even go to the house and do a video tour on behalf of a buyer without some type of contract. You can, however, from a marketing perspective, like here's what's being sold in the neighborhood. Here's a list. Do your own due diligence. A lot of buyers do that, right? They have searches and stuff that allow buyers to go look for potential houses in the market. I do that as well, but they can't open a door unless there's a contract in place. So that's the good, transparency. The bad, buyers may go directly to the listing agent and either have the listing agent represent them or not be represented at all. And the ugly is this, guys. It's going to cause a disruption in the market, and there's going to be a lot of confusion. And I really think the people that are going to get hurt the most is the exact people that the president tried to say, hey, if your credit is not as good, you'll pay a lower interest rate than if your credit is better, because it's going to be the first-time home buyers, the ones that have no money, the ones that have scraped enough around enough money to pay for closing costs and to buy a house. We already know houses probably overpriced or really high. It's such a seller's market. they're going to get hurt the most. And the ugly part of it is home ownership, in my opinion, is going to continue to decrease as prices continue to increase. Remember that savings President Biden said is going to happen? I don't think it's going to happen. Home prices are going to continue to increase, and you're going to have less buyers out there because they're not going to be able to pay anybody to be represented, and they're not going to trust a listing agent to represent them. And why would they? I'm not saying listing agents are bad, but you just got to look at it like this. It's a natural conflict of interest, and I hate to use this analogy, but I'm gonna. If you're going through a divorce and you're the wife or the husband, are you going to use the other party's attorney? You're not. And that attorney's not even going to allow you to use them because it's a conflict of interest. They have to represent one side or the other. So you will become a customer to the listing agent, and the listing agent will the what's the word? It's not a customer, but you'll have an exclusive agreement with the seller. There'll be a client. The difference between client and customer is client, you can do everything. Customer, you can just offer, I think there's 4 things. You can offer like the price of the house, any material facts with the house. You can't talk about, what's going on in the neighborhood. You can't talk about if there's a strip mall going on, and if there's an airport being, if there's a solar farm. You can't talk about any of that. All you can do is just deal with the facts, and it's going to be upon you, the buyer, to get all of that information. And as a new buyer, you're not going to know. You're not. And you could be buying a house that could have challenges. I can't tell you how many of my clients said thank you for not allowing me to buy that house. I had a conversation a couple of times now. One asked me, should we buy the house? And I actually said no. And they were like shocked. They're like, we've never heard that from a realtor, right? We've never heard a realtor tell us not to buy that house, because aren't you just extenuating the circumstances of getting paid? I'm like, it's not right for you. You guys aren't going to like this house. I understand your goals. I understand what you're trying to do. This house isn't going to work for you. And if it was me putting myself in your shoes, I wouldn't buy it, knowing what I know about you. They didn't buy it. We found them a house, worked perfectly for them. Great. Same with another client. Got a house under contract, went to look at it to do an inspection. No way. Told him, let's pull the deal. It's not going to work. You know what I know. He's like, right, well, what about another one? I need to get here. I'm like, we'll find you another one. We did. Shortly thereafter, went in the contract for another house. So good buyer brokers are going to always represent their clients to their best interest, and they're going to put their client first, not themselves first. Listing agents are going to put their client first, which is the seller, not their customer, which is the buyer, because fiduciarily they have responsibility to the listing agent, not the buyer. So be careful out there, buyers, when you can't negotiate, or when you think about not hiring a broker, a realtor that is going to represent you. Be careful if you go directly to the listing agent, because you're not going to get equal representation. You're just not. It's a conflict of interest. And also, you need to start doing some due diligence. Like, what's the buyer broker going to do for you, right? Are they going to do more than just open a door? What is their resume? Do they have testimonials? Do they have other clients that will speak on their behalf of how good they serve them? How many transactions, have they closed? What type of business do they operate, right? And what their fees are, obviously. And what are they going to do to help you lower your closing cost, right? They should know all that. Transparency. There should be transparency. On the other side, ugly guys, is you sellers. You're going to have to be careful too, because let's face it, as a listing agent, it used to be, before the internet and AI and all that, listing agents got paid, let's say 3%, right? Their total commission was 6%, but they'd give some of it to the buyer broker. But let's just say 3%. And they had to put money into marketing. They had to put money into advertising and all that. Guys, most listing agents, including myself, we don't do that anymore. You know why? We don't have to. Because if a house is priced right in this market, it's going to sell itself. That being said, what listing agents do more now than ever before is it's really about the deal in the contracts. As myself, having listed houses, and as other listing agents, we're less worried about getting buyers, especially if we know the house is priced right. We're less worried about getting offers because it is a seller's market. We're more concerned with what type of offer we're going to get, what the terms are, who's the lender, what are some of the challenges that this offer may represent i.e., say the house isn't perfect and needs some work. What does the seller need to look out for that could put this offer in jeopardy, and what is in the best interest for the seller, not only with this offer, but the terms of the offer, the closing of the offer, and how the offer is going to be represented by the buyer and what the expectations are. At the end of the day, guys, it's all about managing expectations. So myself as a listing agent, I'm not ashamed to say it, I don't have to spend a ton of money on marketing anymore. I literally can list a house, do an open house, put it on a multiple listing service, advertise it to all my peers out there, those other brokers that have a lot more clients than I do, and get offers assuming the house is priced right. If it isn't priced right, the market will tell you that. The bigger concern I have working for my seller is what the offers represent and making sure the offer gets closed and it's represented in the best interest by both parties, and the seller totally understands what's happening. No longer do I have to give a bunch of money just to marketing. Not saying I don't. Obviously, I pay for professional pictures. I pay for, it's called Matterport 3D stuff. I do boost it on social media. Obviously, I list on the multiple listing service. Obviously, I have to negotiate showings and offers and contracts and contractors. And there's like 94 touch points. But I'm just trying to say that listing agents don't have to spend as much money, nearly as much money as they used to, on marketing the home. What they really have to do is be that filter and understand what the different contracts that are coming to them and what to expect and what to look out for. Buyers, on the other hand, they get it much tougher. It's a seller's market. So as a buyer, you're going to be in competition. You need to have a buyer broker that understands the market, that understands how you can negotiate to get your offer accepted. Some of the outs, when I say outs, like some of the contingencies that could help you get out of this, like a appraisal contingency, a inspection contingency. There are some others contingencies, but you're going to have to negotiate that with the sellers, making sure that everything that you said you were going to do as a buyer broker for the buyer is done. Because if it isn't, the seller has the right to pull the contract if it isn't met within the time frame that you agreed to, and offer to another offer if an offer comes in afterwards. You may have noticed, guys, and it's happening more and more, most listing agents now say active under contract instead of saying pending. And when you see a house and it says active under contract, if you're a buyer, that means, yes, it's under contract, but we're still accepting other offers, because if this offer falls through, we want to make sure that other people are still submitting offers. In the old days, it used to say pending, and as a buyer broker, I'd say, I can't send this house as pending. Can we put in a backup offer? And can we be in first position? So that's a whole negotiating itself. In other words, if the offer that you have on the table that you're pending with fails, can we be the first backup offer that you accept? That still happens, but not as much. More so happens now is there are pending offers, but it's active under contract, which means the seller is still accepting offers, even though right now they're working on one to try to get to close. So guys, again, the NAR settlement agreement, it's going to happen on August 17th. No longer in the multiple listing service will it advertise how much a buyer broker is going to get paid. The buyer broker is going to have to be transparent and negotiate and make sure that their client understands the services that they're going to provide for them and what that fee is going to be. And then if the buyer broker is smart, which they should be if they've been doing this for a while, they're going to try to get that from the seller in terms of concessions and closing costs. If the listing agent's smart, they're going to also convince, and not convince, but try to articulate to the seller that you should offer concession, because there's going to be a lot more buyers that come to the table if the buyer broker is going to have some concessions versus if you're not going to pay anything. And that's why I said even for sale by owners who sell their own house, offer a buyer commission to most homeowners that come to buy their homes, because they're represented by a buyer. Otherwise, the buyer broker won't bring their client there. So fiduciarily, you're supposed to bring a buyer regardless if you're getting paid or not. The reality is, guys, I shouldn't say most people are not going to show a house to everybody that that house might work for if they're not getting paid. Now, that's not the law. You're supposed to look out for your client first. I'm just telling you reality and what would happen. So just be careful. Make sure you have your I's dotted and T's crossed, and make sure that from both sides, buyers and sellers, make sure you understand what you're getting into. No longer should a seller just say, I'm going to give you 3%. I don't care, right? You're going to want to know what that 3% is for, or 2%, or whatever they're offering. And if they say, well, and I do this, I'll just show it, 3% if I just represent you, 4% if I have to do all the work and bring it and have a buyer. I don't ever offer that anymore. I used to in the beginning, but I realize it's foolhardy because I can't represent the buyer there. So what I normally do is I ask for a commission. Let's just say it's 5%. And I tell my seller, I'm going to give 2% to a buyer broker. And if a buyer comes unrepresented, I'm going to call some of the brokers that I have relationships with, some of the realtors, and I'm going to ask them if they want a client that's looking to buy my listing. And I will give that buyer broker 2% or negotiate it with them, right? But I want to be a arm's distance away from the transaction, because I want that buyer to be represented fairly. And why is that? Even though my fiduciary responsibility is to the seller, because at the end of the day, after closing, I don't want stuff coming back to my seller. I don't want things being said, you never told me this, you never told me that, and I didn't know this was going to happen. That's why you have representation, guys. That's why you have buyer brokers representing your best interests who know what they're doing in the industry. And there's a lot of good ones, but there's some that just aren't that good. And it's the reason why 87%, guys, of realtors who get in this industry leave within the first 2 years, because they can't make any money, because maybe it's 3 years. So you got a bucket of water, it's almost full. You have people jumping in and people jumping out, people jumping in and people jumping out, people jumping in and people jumping up. And it's why the John Tesh radio show said that realtors are rated lower than used car salesmen, because what do they really get paid to do? And if you have a realtor and you've been through a successful closing, you know what your realtor did for you, especially if you wrote them a testimonial. You know what they did for you, and you know that you'd refer them to anybody who asked. So realtors that are worth their weight in gold, they don't have to brag about themselves. Their clients will, and testimonials tells the story. Any realtor should tell you why you should hire them. That isn't the real answer. The real answer is other people should be able to tell you why you should hire them, not them. Because if a realtor can't explain their value proposition to you and get you to believe it, they shouldn't even be in the industry. Getting you to believe it is the key. And just not only listening to their words, but what other people say in the industry about them is part of the key. Other than that, it's your experience with that broker. So I don't know, guys, if I just confused the hell out of you, or if you understand what I said. In close, I'm going to say this: the good, transparency. It's good. Buyers need to understand what they're paying for when they hire a buyer broker. The bad, buyers may go directly to listing agents and not get the representation that they need, because there are a lot of things that the listing agent can't disclose, fiduciarily responsible to the seller. And if the seller's smart, they're not going to accept a dual disclosure, a dual agency, because that means you can disclose everything to the buyer, but now you're not looking out for the best interest of me. And I wouldn't hire a realtor that's going to be able to disclose all my reasons why I'm selling the house to a listing, to a buyer, if I agree that they can be a dual agent. I wouldn't do that. I would say, no, you represent me, or I'll find somebody that just represents me, and the buyer can find somebody that just represents them, and I'm willing to pay a little bit to make sure that they have their own representation, but you need to represent my own interest, because I want the best price for my house, the best terms, the quickest way it's going to be sold based upon my terms. That's the bad. And the ugly is because there's still a lot of confusion in the market. I think there's going to be buyers that are not even going to try to buy homes because between interest rates and the prices of homes now, they think that they're going to have to pay a buyer broker. And they may. Some sellers may not offer it. They think they may have to pay a buyer broker if they close. Here's another tidbit for you guys from buyers like that. One of the things that I've changed in my policies when I bring on a buyer and I say, okay, my fee's 2.5%, and they want to make an offer on a house before we even make that offer, I'm going to call the listing agent. I'm going to send a document to the listing agent, and I'm going to ask that listing agent, is the seller offering concessions to the buyer, and what is that percentage? Or I'm going to write it in the contract saying section 26, buyer is asking for, or maybe it's question 25, buyer is asking for X in terms of concession. So as a buyer broker, you can always go down, you can't go up. So if the seller comes back and says the buyer is offering $2,000 and I want $4,000, then I got to go back to my buyer and say, listen, they're giving $2,000, you need to pay me the additional $2,000, or I'll let it go and I'll only take $2,000. It all depends on the situation, how much work is involved, and how many showings we've had, and how long the client's been with me, or is it a repeat client, or whatever. So I don't know, guys. There's a lot here. I'm sorry if I'm confusing. If you have any questions like before, drop me a comment, send me a question, send me an email. Here's my contact information. I'm going to flash it below. I hope this information was helpful. Just know it's not as bad as everybody's saying it is. Some things have changed. You got to be careful, both from the buy side and now I think also from the sell side. And this all goes into effect August 17th as the rules change. Honestly, I don't see much changing actually in the way houses actually go down. The sellers will offer buyer concessions. Those concessions will be paid, a portion or all of them will be paid to the buyer broker anyways. It's just transparency is the biggest thing. And I don't see houses going down. I don't see, but I could be wrong. I'm going to do a market update here for July, which won't count. I'll do one for August next month. We'll have like 2 weeks of it, but we'll really know by the end of the year, has housing prices come down because of this NAR settlement, or are they still on the rise, or have they come down for another reason, which could be interest rates, could be a number of things. We'll see. Guys, as always, have a safe summer out there. It's beautiful up here in Maine. As you can tell, I haven't done a video in probably 3 weeks. Gotten a little lazy, had an awesome July. We had like, I think it was like 28 days of straight sun. This is the best time to be in Maine, so I try to take advantage of it. I still do my real estate stuff, but not as much in videos. All right, guys, take care. Hope everything is well with you. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you in a week or so. Scott Thibeau over and out. Bye-bye.